I was 10 years old when Grandma came to live with us. It was about 6 months after Grandad passed away, and I guess, looking back, she must have been lonely in that big house of theirs, rattling around with only the grief and memories for company. So, despite a few protests from Mum, my parents took her in. There were no protests from me, none at all. Grandma was loud and fun, and I loved her. She had an almost limitless supply of boiled sweets, and she'd always slip me a couple whenever she saw me. She was always the first to stick up for me when I got in trouble too. But it was her stories I loved best. Grandma had all kinds of stories. Stories about growing up during World War II, and stories about the things she'd get up to with her friends on the south coast, after her family had been evacuated. Sad stories, funny stories, adventure stories. But it was her scary stories that were my favourite. Grandma had a lot of scary stories. She told me she dabbled in the occult when she was a teenager, trying out Ouija boards with her friends, tarot cards, fortune-telling, all that stuff. Most of the stories I'd laugh off or forget about not long after she was done telling them. But there were a couple that really did spook me a bit. I was only 10 at the time, you have to understand, and Grandma certainly knew how to bring the stories to life. She'd shut off the lights in my room, so only the glow of the night sky shone through the curtains, and she'd shuffle in real close enough so I could see the wrinkles on her face and smell the boiled sweets on her breath, close enough so her deep blue eyes could stare straight into mine. She must have given me nightmares with a few of those tales, but now, years later, there's only one I can still remember. Only one that stuck with me. The story of the shower and Mr. Longfingers. Grandma told me about Mr. Longfingers one night after I asked her about baths. Grandma used to love her baths. She'd spend ages in them, light candles and incense, and lie in the tub humming to herself until the water turned cold. It drove my mum crazy, but when I asked her why she loved them so much, she said it was the only place that was safe for her to relax. You know, people like me, who are, well, more sensitive to certain things, we have to have baths, she told me seriously one night, shuffling closer on the bed. I couldn't possibly spend that long in the shower. It would be far too risky. Grandma stared at me with those blue eyes of hers, unsmiling, and I knew it was time for one of her stories, one of the scary ones. I shivered with pleasure and pulled up the covers to my chin. Why is it risky, Grandma? She half turned to look out the window, watching me from the corner of her eye, pausing for effect. I waited, feeling my heart rate pick up ever so slightly in my chest. Well, she said after a moment, it's only risky if you close your eyes, of course. If you close your eyes for longer than 10 seconds. What do you mean? Why? Well, do you ever play that game in the playground with your friends? The one where someone turns their back and the other sneaks up on them when they're not looking? I nodded, and Grandma nodded back. Exactly. So that's what it's like in the shower, when you have your eyes closed. That's what it's like with Mr. Longfingers. A cold itch tickled my back. Who's Mr. Longfingers, Grandma? She let out a deep breath, as if she wished she hadn't said anything, turned her head back to face mine. When she next spoke, she'd lowered her voice. No one knows exactly, Grandma whispered. Some think it's a creature that's attracted to the heat and smell we give off in there. Others think it's a demon that finds a way into our realm through the dense steam clouds. No one can say for sure, because the only ones who have actually seen Mr. Longfingers aren't ever going to be able to tell you. I pulled in a breath. Why not? Grandma shuffled closer along the bed and leaned towards me, leaving my question hanging in the air. "Don't you worry about it, sweetheart. Don't you worry your pretty head. As long as you remember the rules, you'll be fine." "What rules?" "Well, when you're in the shower, you try not to close your eyes for too long. 5 seconds is fine, and 10 is just about okay too. But any longer than that..." "Yeah? Then what?" "Well, any longer than that, and you may just start to feel something in the room with you. Something watching. And if you ever go longer than 15 seconds, that's when you might hear a noise too." "Hear what?" "The soft tap, tap, tap of fingers on glass. Fingers drumming against the glass door of the shower. If you do ever hear that noise, God forbid, will you make me a promise?" "What, Grandma?" "Promise me you'll never open your eyes." I barely slept that night. Hardly at all. I'd close my eyes and try to relax, but every time I did, I'd imagine a face pressed against my bedroom window, staring at me. And when I did finally get to sleep, I had nightmares. Bad ones. I had them all week, in fact. Dreams about disembodied eyes watching me in the dark and long fingers reaching out to touch my exposed skin. It wasn't any better when I was awake either. Not really. The shower was the worst. That's when Grandma's story really got to me. I never thought about it before, but suddenly I had trouble shutting my eyes in there. I'd be standing beneath the beating water, shampoo running down my face, and as soon as I squinted my eyelids closed, I'd hear Grandma's words running through my head. 5 seconds is fine, and 10 is just about okay, but any longer than that? I'd rub my hair fast, feeling the shampoo dripping off my chin, and as soon as I counted past 5 seconds, I'd feel it. A sort of pressure. Not a feeling of being watched exactly, but something close to that. I'd run my fingers faster and faster through my hair, frantically trying to get the suds out, and the ready blackness behind my closed eyes, coupled with a rush of water over my ears, would feel like a held breath, like the silence before a scream. The seconds would race through my mind, and I'd be so desperate to open my eyes again that I'd sometimes do it before my hair was rinsed fully clean, and my eyes would sting with shampoo. But before I shut them again, I'd always be sure to peer out through the stained glass door of the shower cubicle, just to make sure I was alone. It wasn't long before Mum realised something was up. She heard me crying out in my sleep one night and came in to comfort me, asked me what the matter was, and it all came out. I told her about Grandma's stories, about Mr. Longfingers. She got this look on her face when I was telling her, like she used to get with me when I'd made her really mad. This wide-eyed, angry look. Only this time, she wasn't angry with me. She was angry with Grandma. My parents' room was next to mine, and sometimes, if I pressed my ear against the wall, I could hear them talking in there. Soft whispers. That night though, after Mum was satisfied I wasn't scared anymore and she'd got back to her room, the whispers weren't soft at all. Oh no. I heard Mum hissing to Dad about Grandma, about the story she told me. Mum's voice floated through the wall, sharp and crisp. "You know what your damn mother said to him now, don't you, Simon?" Dad's response was an unintelligible mutter. "She's told him there's a monster that'll get him if he shuts his eyes in the shower. A monster! The poor kid's been having nightmares about it all week. Seriously, Simon, you'd better say something to her tomorrow morning, first thing. Or I will." Grandma came to visit me in my room the following night. That time, as she perched on the end of my bed, there were no stories. Nothing like that. Grandma just sat there and stared down at me, her blue eyes wide and sad. The light from the moon outside my window lit up her wrinkled face. "You know I'd never let anything bad happen to you, don't you?" she said after a moment. I nodded my head. "I know, Grandma. You know I wouldn't let you come to any harm." I nodded again. "Okay, good. That's good." She looked away from me for a moment, out the window. "You know, the things I tell you in the evening are meant to help you, sweetheart. They're meant to toughen you up a bit, protect you." She paused and shook her head. "But maybe your mum's right. Maybe I went too far this time." She looked down at me and smiled. But even then, even though I was only 10 years old, I could tell it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll tell you what," said Grandma. "You know what I told you about Mr. Longfingers and the shower? Well, I'm going to make sure you're safe. I'll scare the bugger off. How about that? It won't come back in a hurry if it has to face me." I stared up at Grandma, watching her face glow in the moonlight, watching her smile down at me. I nodded my head once. I was the one who found her. I don't know when exactly it happened, but I guessed it was about a week after we had that talk in my room. A week after she told me she wouldn't let me come to any harm. I woke early that morning from a bad dream to a heavy thumping sound. I sat bolt upright in bed. My room was quiet around me, and I couldn't hear anything from the wall that joined my parents' room either. But the house wasn't entirely silent. Floating down the hall, muffled by my closed door, I could hear the sound of rushing water, the noise of the shower. I leapt out of bed and ran down the upstairs hallway, heart already pounding my chest. As soon as I reached the closed bathroom door, I started banging it. A deep terror was welling up inside me like cold water from a well, something I couldn't place, and I kept banging and shouting, "Grandma!" over and over again, even though she didn't respond. Off to my right, I was dimly aware of voices from my parents' room, the sleepy shuffle of footsteps. But before they had a chance to make it out onto the landing, I lifted up my hand to test the door handle, more out of instinct than because I thought it might actually open. But the door was locked. I kept banging with my free hand, and it swung suddenly inwards, bringing me face to face with a wall of steam. Heat struck my skin. I squinted my eyes against the damp fog and peered into the bathroom. And before Dad pushed me to one side, before everything around me descended into shouting and tears and chaos, I saw her. I saw Grandma. She was lying naked on the floor in the shower cubicle, the water beating down around her, blue eyes bulging from her face. One hand was curled against her chest like a dead bird, while the other trailed against the glass of the shower cubicle, the flailing finger marks she'd carved through the steam still clear and fresh. It was a heart attack that killed her. That's what my dad told me. He said Grandma was old, and the thing had struck her quickly and suddenly. She would have died fast and without pain, Dad said. She wouldn't have suffered. I knew better though. Even as a 10-year-old kid, I knew better. And years later, thinking about this as an adult, I still know better. I also know my wife and kids resent me for refusing to have a shower in the house, for insisting everyone take baths. They pretend it's okay, and they humour me, but I can tell they don't really understand it. Not at all. My wife thinks she does. She thinks I still carry the trauma of seeing my grandmother dying in front of me when I was little. I guess she is right, in a way. but she doesn't know the full truth. Nobody does. And no one would believe me, even if I told them. No one would believe me if I said the reason I didn't take showers, the reason I haven't had one since I was 10 years old, isn't because I'm scared from the sight of a dead body. It's because, all those years ago, when I crept back into the still hot bathroom after the paramedics had taken Grandma's body downstairs, I made sure to check the marks her fingers had carved through the stained glass of the shower cubicle. And those marks weren't just on the inside. I live in a small town in southern Texas, probably about a 20-minute drive to the border of Mexico. I am 16 years old, and this is my first time being so far from my home on the west coast. My father is a coast guardsman who was stationed here to provide extra help to Border Patrol. At the time, the politics of this was beyond me. As far as I was concerned, I was forced away from my friends, family, and pretty much everything I knew. I would start my sophomore year of high school here. I was nervous. All the kids would already have their pre-established friend groups. My dad gave me several warnings. If anyone offers you a free cell phone, don't take it. It's probably drug traffickers. They will call the phone and threaten to kill your family if you don't do a job for them. Be careful of people inviting me places I don't know. Since I am white in an area dominated by low-income families, I can be used for a large ransom as people will assume my family has money. Thanks, Dad. Way to make me feel better about being forced here against my will. School started without too much of a hitch. It was not as bad as I figured it would be. The other students were welcoming, and I soon had a few people I would talk to regularly. But I could tell by the way they talked and their body language that we weren't friends yet. In my second week of school, I met Gabe. Gabe was a chill dude, always wearing band tees and Converse, talking about his favourite bands and how he wanted to be a professional guitar player. Me and him got along great. I would say he was my first real friend. "Justin, do you want to come to my place this weekend and chill?" Gabe asked me as we walked through the crowded hallway. "For sure, dude. I think we can sneak some beer from my dad," I offered. I would not be able to sneak any beer. I knew I would get caught, but fitting in was far more important to me. "Nah, don't worry about it." Gabe dismissed the idea. "I've got plenty. I'm Mexican, pendejo. Getting beer is easy." Gabe seemed to gloat. I was relieved that I wouldn't be stealing my dad's beer. "I'm going to have a couple other friends over too. It's going to be like a small party, man." "Sweet, dude. Sounds like a plan. Let's get stupid this weekend," I responded. I knew there was a reason I liked you. Gabe beamed and held up a fist. I bumped his fist with mine, and we split to our separate classes. I told my dad I got invited over for a sleepover. I gave him the address of the house. My father was a military man and no idiot. He wrote down the address and gave me some father-son advice. "Listen, kid, I was your age once. If you aren't drinking this weekend, I know you will eventually. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you are forced to drive with a drunk driver, you call me. I will pick you up, no questions asked, no punishment." I nodded. He walked up to the fridge and pulled out a beer. He held the can horizontally as he flipped out his pocket knife and stabbed the hole near the bottom of the can. "This is called shotgunning. Honestly, I shouldn't be teaching this to you, but I want you to fit in as bad as you want to fit in. You hit them with one of these right off the bat, and you will have instant respect." He lifted the can up, and in a flash popped the top and chugged the entire thing through the hole. I was impressed. I practiced the shotgun with one of his beers before my buddies arrived to grab me. "Remember, kid, call me if you need me." He put his pocket knife into my hand, and with that, I was off. Including me and Gabe, There were 4 people total in the car. Gabe was in the front passenger seat. I was in the back with some guy I didn't know, and some girl I'd never met was driving. The guy next to me passed me a beer and introduced himself. "Sup, I'm Jeremy." Jeremy was on the thicker end of the weight spectrum, but he carried it well, and you could tell he was strong. I decided I would put my dad's advice to the test. Before I answered, I flipped out the knife and proceeded to shotgun the beer. "I'm Justin." It had the desired effect. I heard Gabe let out a cheer from the front seat. "Coolest new kid ever," came Gabe's voice. I was smiling in pride. "Mad respect, bro. That was dope," said Jeremy. "Hey, don't be doing that crap in my car. Wait till we get to Gabe's. No more drinking in here." The girl's voice sounded annoyed, the Hispanic accent she had only adding to the whip-like effect her voice carried. We chatted for the rest of the ride about our favourite bands, the kids at school we didn't like, and the girls we thought were hot. Finally, we arrived at Gabe's place. It was your standard suburban home. It looked run down and unkempt, but not unlivable. The lawn was just a patch of dead grass, and the house itself looked dirty. Inside of the house was better. It was clean and smelled of incredible Mexican food. We went directly into Gabe's room. His room was about average size and contained a bunk bed and a desk. Under the desk was a guitar amp. On the wall hung an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar. The carpet was brown shag, and despite its ugly appearance, it was very comfortable to step on. Gabe sat on his bed, and the girl sat next to him. Jeremy grabbed the chair and rolled it to me, then proceeded to pull out the amp to use as a seat. "Pass a beer to me and Nissa," came Gabe's voice. Jeremy reached under the desk and pulled out an 18-pack of some beer I had never heard of. The name was in Spanish. He passed the beer out to everyone. "Warm beer, my favourite." Nissa's sarcastic tone of voice conveyed her displeasure, but she opened the can and drank it anyway. I was noticing that Nissa was very pretty. She had long, straight brown hair, a slender figure, and large, dark brown eyes. She didn't seem to be with Jeremy or Gabe romantically, so I figured I might stand a real chance. I decided to wait for the night to progress to see how she acted towards me before trying anything. Around 11 at night, Jeremy tossed the empty beer box into the middle of the room. "We need to get more. Let's go," Jeremy's voice commanded us. Nissa rolled her eyes at him. "Yeah, and who put you in charge? It's my car we're risking, and I don't think I want to risk it." "Come on, Nissa, it's just a beer run," Gabe rebutted. Nissa finally gave in, and we all loaded up. We drove for about 15 minutes until we came to a dirt road off the side of the main street. It was more like a wide pathway than an actual road. I became slightly nervous when Nissa switched off the headlights as we turned into it. It was surrounded by trees and tall brush on either side. Eventually, we came to a stop at a small clearing. We got out, and I noticed we were at the edge of a body of water. The river was about 40 yards across, and I could see a small, lit-up building on the other side, a bit inland. "That's the gas station we get our beer from," Gabe explained as he pointed to the lights. "And this," he pointed to the water, "is the Rio Grande. It's incredibly easy to cross here because of how narrow it is," he explained. "Wait, you mean the Rio Grande River? The border? As in Mexico is on the other side? That Rio Grande?" I questioned in worried tone. "That's the one," Jeremy answered in Gabe's place. "You gonna chicken out, new kid?" Nissa's voice quipped. She folded her arms like wings and balked at me like a chicken. With my teenage pride and reputation on the line, I faked confidence and prepared to cross. "So, how do we cross? Do we just swim?" I asked. They laughed and Jeremy pulled out a small rowboat out from the brush. We all squeezed in and prepared for a short journey across the river. The water was calm and it was almost pitch black, making us virtually undetectable. I couldn't believe I was going to cross the border to buy beer, and then cross back. As scared as I was of getting caught, it was exhilarating to be breaking the rules in such a manner. We made it to the other side without issue. We pulled the boat up on land and hid it in the tall grass. "Welcome to Mexico," Gabe patted my back. The gas station was probably a quarter-mile inland. I would take about 5 minutes to reach. I thought I could hear rustling in the grass around us, but figured it was just the wind or some animals. Nissa and Jeremy talked about getting a different brand this time, when 3 people in ski masks and jackets appeared from the grass in front of us. We all froze. "Gabe, is this not—" He cut me off. "Shut up." I did as he said and shut my mouth. The men started talking in Spanish, and Gabe and Jeremy talked back to them. After about a minute, Gabe turned around and shouted, "Run!" One of the men grabbed Nissa before she had a chance. I ran as fast as my feet would take me. I made it all of about 15 feet before I was tackled to the ground by other men who were hiding in the brush. I pulled out the knife my dad gave me and stabbed the man in the leg with all my might. I heard a howl of pain and took the chance to squirm out of the man's grip and right into another. I fell backwards and found myself looking down the barrel of a pistol. "That's enough, kid," came the man's deep voice from behind his mask. "If you try to pull anything like that again, I'll shoot you in both legs." I gulped and nodded, too afraid to speak. The man stabbed in the leg came limping around. He walked up to me, stared me in the eyes a moment, and backhanded me across the face. I screamed in shock and pain and fell over from the force, tears stinging my eyes, and some kind of cloth was pulled over my head. It smelled of sweat and cigarettes. I was pulled up to my feet and they confiscated my phone. I had my hands bound in front of me with a thick zip tie. I was walking for what seemed like hours. They occasionally nudged me, correcting my course, turning here and there. I was eventually loaded into a vehicle and felt all hope of escape leave my body as the engine roared to life. I had no way to tell where I was being taken. I couldn't tell what direction we were heading or how fast we were moving. I tried to remember all the turns we took like they did in the movies, but soon realised it was a futile effort. I found that without being able to see anything, it was hard to tell how long we had been driving. I figured it was probably about an hour or so. The drive became rougher, and I assumed we were now off any paved road and driving on dirt. This kept up for another half hour or so. The vehicle finally began to slow, and I felt the vehicle jerk as the park was engaged. I was pulled out and walked a short distance. Through the cloth, I could see the warm orange glow and hear the crackle of fire. The familiar smell of campfire filled my nostrils. The cloth was taken off my head. I looked around in a vain attempt to see where I was. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but hard dirt in all directions. The night was clear, but the moon did little to light the area. The bonfire and hanging lanterns were the only discernible sources of light. I saw several rusty metal tables with white bricks wrapped in plastic stacked all over them. There were a few men with rifles hanging across their chests standing guard. I took a deep breath to keep myself calm. I was fairly sure I'd been kidnapped by a drug cartel. Nissa was brought to stand next to me, and then Jeremy on my other side. I was relieved to see they were okay. We all exchanged glances, but none of us said a word, afraid of what would happen if we talked. A man in a dark maroon button-down shirt tucked into his blue jeans approached us. The top button was undone, and his thick chest hair was peeking out. He was sporting a thick black mustache. A holster with a large pistol rested on his hip. You could tell by his body language and the way the men cleared a path for him that he was in charge here. "I brought them, sir. just like you asked." Gabe's sheepish voice came from behind us. "Yes, you sure did." The man's deep voice was smooth and friendly with a Hispanic accent, giving off a comforting vibe. He gestured for Gabe to approach. Gabe walked to him nervously. He was not bound like the rest of us. I exchanged glances with Jeremy and Nissa. Nissa stood resolute, her face showing no sign of emotion. I would have believed that she was calm, but the tears rolling down her face betrayed her. "And you did well, my child. Your family will not be harmed." He turned around and took a single step away. "Ah, but I can't have any loose ends walking around now, can I?" Gabe stood rigid and said nothing. In practiced motion, the man turned around, unfastening the holster to his gun, and shot Gabe in the forehead. Nissa screamed as Gabe's lifeless body crumpled to the ground. I squeezed my eyes shut and looked away, fighting with a vomit that wanted to escape my stomach. The man squatted over Gabe's body and gave a silent prayer. "Worry not, child. Your family will be safe." The man made a gesture, and 2 men came to drag Gabe's body away. "You know, the government has been making things harder of late," the man began to explain as he approached us. "Cracking down on our operations, raiding our safe houses, boarding our ships. We have been forced to find creative ways to make money." He examined us carefully. "And you 3 will do wonderfully. As a man of God, I am not entirely happy about what is to be done with you. But life is game, and I play to win." He shrugged in spite of himself and looked over his shoulder to one of the guards with the rifles. "How long until the buyer arrives?" he barked. "The buyer is here, sir," the man shouted back. My heart was beating so intensely, I was afraid it was going to explode out of my chest. We were ushered to the other side of the camp, towards a black, windowless van. 2 men stood at the rear of the van, dressed in long, loose, dark red robes with hoods pulled over their faces. "If your people didn't have money, I would murder the lot of you where you stood." My captors spat at the feet of the robed men. Their only response was to open the van doors and pull out a briefcase. They opened it to reveal stacks of cash, both in American dollars and Mexican pesos. "Count it," my captor commanded to one of his men. After about 10 minutes of high-tension silence, the man stood up and announced that the money was all accounted for. "May you rot," the leader hissed to them as he pushed us towards the robed men. We were loaded into the van and the doors were shut behind us. We were soon on our way again, to a new place, filled with new horrors. None of us spoke. We only looked at each other with worried glances. Gabe's murder was still fresh in our minds. The van stopped and we were ushered out. I looked around again, hoping to recognize anything, but again found it hopeless. The only thing of note was the large, warehouse-like building that we were being shepherded into by the robed men. We entered through a door on the side of the building. The inside was dark, only lit by large white candles. Pentagrams decorated the walls, and the skulls of various animals and humans filled the spots the pentagrams did not. I could feel the beads of sweat dripping down my face, despite the cool air of the place. I felt Nissa's hand grasp the back of my shirt. She was shaking. I was in no better shape. Eventually, we were ushered into a large open room. 5 braziers stood in a large star formation, each at the tip of a giant pentagram that decorated the floor. In the middle of the pentagram stood a tall wooden structure. I squinted my eyes, trying to figure out what it was. I felt my entire body chill at the realization. It was a small gallows. The room was filled with robed people. Hoods darkened the faces of all of them. Nissa was grabbed first. She was dragged towards the gallows as she screamed, overpowered by the two people that held her. I wanted to help her. Every fibre of my being told me to man up and help her. But I was too afraid, frozen in fear. Nissa sobbed for help. I felt tears roll down my cheeks. I looked at Jeremy standing next to me. He was crying too. One of the roped figures pulled the rope down and tied it around Nissa's feet. They hoisted her into the air feet first until her head was about 6 feet off the ground. Another roped figure appeared from the crowd and walked towards the center of the pentagram. Her robe dropped to the ground, revealing the nude body of one of the most beautiful women I have ever laid eyes on. She stood directly under Nissa. I could faintly see as shimmers reflecting orange firelight fell to the ground. They were Nissa's tears. The figures around us stood in a circle formation and began chanting in a language I did not understand. I could hear drums banging in ritual fashion. The figure stepped up onto the gallows towards Nissa with a curved knife. She thrashed as he approached. With a single fluid motion, he slit her throat. She thrashed about and made gurgling noises as the blood drained from her. The woman, standing naked below, showered in the blood. Eventually, Nissa's body stopped moving, but the blood kept coming. The woman just stood there, her arms outstretched towards the sky, reveling in it. The thick blood coated her skin, giving it a sickening red sheen. She held her eyes closed, and a large smile stretched across her face. I felt something tap my arm. It was Jeremy. He whispered in a shaky voice, "We have to make a break for it. They aren't watching us. It's our only chance." I looked. He was right. They were all focused on the macabre display at the center. I nodded and bolted the way we came. Jeremy was not far behind me. I heard shouts as we traversed the hallways. There was only one way to go. I found the door we entered through and burst out of it. I sprinted as fast as I could towards the darkness. I heard Jeremy scream and looked back. He had been tackled near the door. I saw a roped figure bash him in the face with the butt of his knife, shutting him up. "I'm sorry," I shouted and turned around to continue my sprint. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I said to myself as I ran. I was thankful for the cover of night and the tall brush. They couldn't drive out here, and I was smaller than them, giving me a slight advantage. Eventually, I stopped hearing their shouts. I kept moving, determined to put as much space between them and I as possible. After hours of walking, I came upon a road. I followed it. It had to lead somewhere. It wasn't like I had any other option. Eventually, the sun came up as I walked. With a new light, I was able to see a town down the street. With new resolve and hope, I walked towards it, carefully watching over my shoulder for any type of black van. I came upon a convenience store and walked in. The clerk looked at me with worried eyes and started to speak to me in Spanish, looking me over. "English?" I said to him. He looked disappointed and shook his head no. He handed me a water bottle and walked into the back room, and came back with a girl who looked to be around 20. She spoke English, with a heavy accent. "Are you okay? What happened to you? You're covered in blood and dirt." Her voice conveyed genuine worry. The question forced me to recall the night, causing me to sob uncontrollably. She hugged me and motioned for the clerk to call the cops. At the end of the day, I found myself in a police cruiser heading home. I told both Mexican and American cops what had happened in full detail. I showed them the spot with the boat and the place we had been ambushed. As far as I know, the investigation is still ongoing, but no arrests have been made yet. We moved to a new town further north and took on new names under witness protection. My father's orders still stood, but now he assisted in illegal immigration in the town we lived in, rather than on the border. I had not tried to make any new friends. I was a loner now, and I was okay with that. Today, I was walking through a Target, looking for some new clothes. I'd found a shirt that I liked, and figured that would be enough for today and went to check out. "Will that be all today, sir?" came the voice of the woman manning the checkout station. "Yes, that'll be it." I looked up at a beautiful face with her large brown eyes and smile I recognized. Panic welled up in me. It was the same woman who had bathed in Nissa's blood. I took my shirt from her with a shaky hand. She watched me with a big smile as I walked in cold fear towards the door. As I was about to walk out, she licked her lips and winked at me. I want it more than anything. I don't need fame or riches, although I wouldn't say no if the world offered up either. I want my work to matter. I want people to discuss it in classrooms and book clubs and bars and wherever else people gather. On the television show Big Brother, one of my many vices I've since discarded, one contestant, Cody, he of the forgotten surname and season number, said, "I want to succeed more than I want to breathe." I may have butchered the quote. I heard it for the first time over 10 years ago and will never forget the sentiment. Cody did not end up winning Big Brother. He came in second place. I will not forget that either. I started writing when I was 18. A late start. Bradbury claims 1,000 words per day from the age of 12, but a late start is better than no start. I did not go to college, because one should not waste time or money on greater education along the road to being a writer. At 18, I didn't appreciate the value of youth, but I'm in eternal gratitude to my younger self for having the good sense not to fret my life away before some grizzled professor. Chuck Palahniuk once said, "We must all give away our youth for something." I probably butchered that quote just as much as I did Cody's, but once again, the message rings true. I traded my best years away for learning to write. I do not regret it. I got a job bartending at the Irish pub, and there is nothing remarkable or noteworthy about that. The stories and lessons learned on the job, and few they were, will speak through my fiction. I would hate to ruin Mrs. Patterson's story, the time a Molotov cocktail crashes through her apartment window during a Santa Claus parade, by spoiling it with what really happened and who it really happened to. Stephen King's on writing, William Strunk Jr.'s Elements of Style, and Ray Bradbury's Zen in the Art of Writing came first. I learned to cut adverbs and make sentences punch like Tyson and develop one's own style. I learned from Stephen King that a great novelist should cut their teeth writing short stories, so I wrote 3 in one day. Eggs, about a young boy abused by his father after forgetting to pick up the titular food from the grocery store. Magnets and Celluloid, about a plastic surgeon who creates and is eventually murdered by his robot girlfriend. And The Loveland Frogs, based upon mythology out of Loveland, Ohio. Today, I know these 3 stories are not worth the bites they are stored upon, but they were passable first efforts. Most importantly, I learned that to be a great writer, one needs to be a great reader. And so, before my 19th birthday, I read the entire catalogues of Shirley Jackson, Lovecraft, and as much as the aforementioned writers I could. It was not enough. I broke up with Stephanie, my girlfriend of 3 years. I started listening to podcasts about motivation and determination, and learned that the latter is more necessary than the former. There is much to be learned from the uber-successful if one can cast aside envy, and 2 thematic constants arose after thorough research of Jobs, Zuckerberg, Musk and Bezos: discipline and luck. After a long shift on Saturday night, I asked one of the cooks, Alex, to tattoo the paradigms on my arms. The ink poisoned me, and I spent a week in the hospital. Upon release, I had the tattoos done by a professional and hid rat poison outside of Alex's apartment for his dog to eat. This prompted a short story, Marigold. In Marigold, Alex, renamed Roland Mears, loses his faithful bull terrier Gillian to bone cancer, and after Roland buries her in a field of flowers, she comes back to life and convinces him to start murdering cats. In real life, the dog was a husky. It ate the rat poison and died. I quit working at the Irish pub after my 20th birthday when an Indigo opened up in Lancaster Mall. By transitioning from server to cashier, my income was cut almost in half, but after accounting for the discount on books and the sheer volume of what I was able to steal, the career move was a net positive. My 20th year also marked the start of my first novel, One Last August in the West, a horror western similar in tone to King's the Gunslayer. I put down 110,000 words in 2 months, edited it down to 95,000 in a third, and submitted my manuscript to every literary agent in New York, Los Angeles, Toronto, and Chicago. It was unanimously rejected. But writers rarely end up getting their first novel published. Brandon Sanderson was working on his 13th novel when his 6th got picked up. I committed to 2,000 words per day, and as penance, I flushed my distracting cell phone down the toilet, along with 2 liters of Coca-Cola and the rest of the processed sugar in my kitchen. On December 31st, 2016, I was 25 years old with 6 unpublished novels gathering metaphorical dust in various memory sticks. Instead of literary fame and adoration, I had a mild cocaine addiction and a growing sense that nothing but a black pit of failure lay in my horizon. I missed 3 family Christmas dinners and was not even invited to the 4th. Yet, I can honestly say my passion never wavered. I just needed to put more time in, discipline and luck. When the ink fades, I will carve the words in with a knife. I was fired from Indigo when the manager, Donna, caught me sneaking out with a copy of Joe Hill's The Fireman and Jonathan Jan's Children of the Dark. I hardly cared. I had stolen at least twice my wages worth of books from that hellhole, but the expulsion did leave me without financial stability for a short time. The first stroke of luck came 2 weeks later. My parents died. I can hear you condemning me, perhaps even suspecting me, but I had nothing to do with it. They burned up in a house fire, and as their only child, their estate went to me. The house was worth a few $100,000 before the fire, but my father had always been a penny pincher, and while he neglected to buy house insurance, he did own his own law firm. I was still living in my 1-bedroom apartment, but better than $5 million appeared in my savings account. Thus, my job search ended, and my research began. What are the limits of human productivity? This was the question I sought to answer. Labourers, factory workers and military types likely have some idea of the physical boundaries, but the written word is a product of finesse and creativity. My capacity for conjuring worlds and populaces within them is often derived from the volume and quality of creative material consumed. In other words, I had to inhale creativity in order to exhale it. But that led me back to my question. What is the limit? Or rather, my limit. I split my day into 4ths. 1 quarter for reading, another quarter for writing, 1 for various day-to-day necessities like grocery shopping, laundry, and of course eating, and save the last quarter for sleeping. I discovered I could reduce my non-writing time by consuming mostly shakes and using Amazon to deliver anything I might need. Garbage bags, laundry detergent, protein powder, toilet paper, and other essentials. It was easy enough to arrange for my bills to be paid, electric, hydro, internet, through automatic withdrawal. After considerable research, taken out of day-to-day time and sleep of course, I invested a large sum of my inheritance into exchange-traded funds with high dividend yields. Half of these dividends went into my expense account, and I arranged for a DRIP, dividend reinvestment plan, for the other half. I work for immortality and divine art. My money can work for me. By the end of 2017, I had upped the original 6 hours per day of dedicated writing to 8. I finished 2 more novels that year. Sting, a horror novel about a vampire who transformed between man and tarantula hawk instead of a bat, and The Bot, a futuristic sci-fi about a game show in which 9 human players suss out which among them is really a robot disguised as a human. These went entirely unappreciated by agents and publishers. In On Writing, Stephen King says he received personalized, encouraging rejections when he was a teenager. But I think he must be a damn liar. At 26, I outwork and outwrite the teenager versions of him and any other writer, but have received nothing of the sort. I just needed another stroke of luck and another boost to my productivity. I wondered if agents even bothered with personalized rejections anymore. King, after all, while talented, comes from a different lifetime where books and those who wrote them were common. I added another half hour of writing time to each day by purchasing an expensive pair of gaming glasses, yellow lens sunglasses that reduced the stinging in my eyes after 8.5 hours of staring at screens and squinting at fine print. This translated to more restful sleep, and so I didn't need to spend as much time in bed. Next, I tried medication. I experimented with caffeine, Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse, Concerta, methamphetamine, and cocaine. The resulting prescription? Caffeine in the morning and Adderall in the afternoon. These were the most effective because they avoided the liability and potential of incarceration and could be delivered to my front door. I continued on this way, liberating myself of distractions and increasing productivity, and by April of 2018, I had stretched my writing time to 10 hours per day. By then, my desperation had reached a fever pitch, and in an effort to achieve greatness, I sacrificed another hour of sleep. This hour was devoted purely to querying and developing my query letters for agents and publishers. I also widened the scope of my work. I finished my first mystery, Chicago, on the fall of 2017, but it went undiscovered. I had always known the self-publishing route was one reserved for the untalented and the unremarkable, but I felt I could use the internet to drum up interest. I created my own website, carlstories.com, but traffic started low and sank to 2 or 3 page views per day, then to 2 or 3 per week. I abandoned the website. I'm no marketer. I realized I could save additional time by pouring my daily meal replacements into an IV drip and drinking through a self-sealing straw whenever my stomach grumbled. On June 14th, I received my first personalized rejection from agent Carol Alden Robbins for my Star Wars-inspired space opera, Glow Forever. Carol informed me that my work was good, but not quite what she was looking for at the moment. I emailed her back immediately, requesting that she pass my work along to a colleague of hers who might be more interested and looking for clients. After 6 months with no reply, I mailed Carol a bomb. I wasted an entire day building the damn thing by dissecting my own electronics and ordering other necessary components from darker corners of the internet. I wasted an afternoon driving up to Toronto and personally putting the thing in a mailbox. After Carol Alden Robbins exploded, she was resurrected briefly by the media, then laid to rest 3 days later when a hurricane smashed into Florida and devastated a community of morons who thought they could stand up to Mother Nature. The murder and subsequent hurricane led to a crime thriller, Utopia Devil. Not long after that, I began to consider the possibility of a 24-hour workday. I had already solved the more difficult bits. My finances, bills and expenses were taken care of, and would be taken care of for the foreseeable future. My investments were performing even better than I'd projected, and I was saving extra money by only using electricity for my laptop and writing naked to reduce the time spent doing laundry. The first true obstacles were food and water, but I had already mostly solved that as well. I couldn't quite go on endlessly. Not yet. But if I put larger holding containers and filled them with food that could last, say, a week or so unrefrigerated, I would only need to stop when the food basins needed a refill. Rain barrels could collect drinking water. I only needed to buy a filtration system. Sleep was the real killer here. Yes, I could use drugs. I had access to a bottomless supply of legal drugs and could pay someone to bring them to me. It would not even be difficult to rig up a zipline between my desk chair and the mail slot I'd cut into the door, with permission from the apartment people, of course. I bought a clothesline and a food court tray off of Amazon as soon as the idea occurred to me. Still though, eventually, I would have to sleep. I could stay up for days at a time with enough stimulants, but I would crash. In the past, before I created my strict schedule, I would occasionally go on 12 to 15-hour writing sprees. The results were inevitably disappointments, cardboard characters, plots like Swiss cheese, run-on sentences, and plenty of adverbs. I debated for a long time, much longer than what I generally spend evaluating each efficiency. The simple truth was, I was scared. To commit myself utterly to the craft was a more difficult hammer to drop than poisoning a dog, starting a fire, or even crafting a pipe bomb. I was casting aside more than friends and family with this move. I would be expelling my life, any sense of self beyond what I could transcribe in a work of fiction. I reasoned that if my body began to fail, I could always pull out and resume my 10 hours of writing per day. I want to be great. While contemplating a non-stop workday, I stumbled upon another great distraction, in both a literal and figurative sense. I was being impeded by my own manhood. I dialed 911 and informed them of what was to happen. When the first red light splashed the inside of my study, I performed the procedure. The pain was exquisite and vicious. I urinate through a plastic tube now. The tube is taped up to the wall and runs into the kitchen sink. Mentally, I'm no longer encumbered by perverse urges. Physically, I save 15 minutes a day. I took the plunge into permanent work. Water so deep and cold and lonely and dark from the surface, but once inside, oh how good it felt to swim. I'm writing forever. The drugs and network of electrical engineering handiwork provide stimulation to my nervous system to keep me awake. I am eternity. I've never felt more alive. I am fed and watered and stimulated. But there is one new, small problem. I hear rats in the walls. If they fit to provoke me, I will simply have cats delivered to the premises and arrange for pet sitters to visit. They will grow old and their grandchildren will fall over themselves to hear one more time about how Grandpa or Grandma had the privilege of servicing the greatest writers of all time. He through which the muse flowed and flowed and flowed and never stopped. And if the beasts can get to my toes before the hungry felines arrive, what do I care? What need have I for toes and legs? With less flesh in my body, my nutritional requirements will be slashed by a third or more. I have an idea. I have nothing but ideas. Christmas Day 1999 was, and will likely remain, the most terrifying day of my life. I was young, pursuing my dream of forensic anthropology at Boston University under Professor Mannis. He was my mentor, intelligent, tenured, and inspiring. Our class had taken trips to his body farm in upstate New York a few times throughout the semester. It consisted of a variety of environments that were perfect for studying various rates of decomposition: dense woods, thick brush, open fields, ponds, creeks, sheds, cabins, and even a swampy marsh. In the center of it all was the Mannis home, an ancient yet beautiful colonial tucked beneath the massive pines. On the last day of classes before winter break, Professor Mannis gently grabbed my arm as I was leaving his lecture and asked me to sit with him for a few moments. As we sat and sipped coffee, he asked what my plans were for the holidays. The question was unexpected, but not off-putting. I told him that I was going to stay with my friend, Jess. He asked why I wasn't spending it with family, and I went on to explain that I had grown up in the foster system. He apologised profusely, for which I told him it was okay. Professor Manis took another drink and told me he would be spending Christmas, as well as the remainder of winter, with his sister's family in Florida, leaving his estate and body farm vacant. I smiled softly as I realised what he was about to inquire. "You're the top student in class by far. How would you like to work on the Manis body farm this winter as part of your PhD program and continue my research while I'm down south?" he asked. Christmas with the corpses. I couldn't have said yes faster. If only I had known the horrors that were awaiting me. I pulled down the long, gravel drive in my old Civic and the mansion came into view. It was even more beautiful in the snow. I parked the car, walked to the front door and unlocked it with the large, brass key Professor Manis had given me. I was beaming. There were 5 specimens planted on the property that I was to study. Subject 1. Female, elderly, 36 months deceased, field. Subject 2. Male, adult, 2 months deceased, sealed barrel outside of shed. Subject 3. Female, elderly, 8 months deceased, inside shed under tarp. Subject 4. Male, young adult, 13 months deceased, dry creek bed. Subject 5. Young adult, 2 weeks deceased, bank of pond, submerged. I gave each specimen a nickname based on their location. There was Fiona Field, Barry Barrel, Sheila Shed, Craig Creek, and Polly Pond. Immature and unprofessional? Maybe, but it helped me keep track and made the morbid reality a little easier to deal with. To be honest, the work was easy, quick and uneventful. Unfortunately, this did not last long. Each morning at 9 AM, I would make my rounds and notate each specimen's current stage of decomposition, as well as any signs of wildlife interference. It was solemn and a bit eerie, but I was doing good work. Work that would help the criminal justice system and forensic scientists. At least, that's what I told myself. Things had become routine by the 3rd day. I would put on my latex gloves and medical mask, followed by my snow gear. Most of the specimens could be studied visually from a short distance, with the exception of Barry Barrel and Sheila Shed, whom I would have to examine physically due to their respective shelters. The subjects were decomposing at their expected rates. All but one. I walked to the edge of the pond and stared at Polly, frozen beneath the ice. Her head seemed to rest comfortably on the bank, while her eyes remained a blank slate gazing towards the winter sky. Polly's feet were a blur of white as they stretched toward the depths. The scene was almost peaceful, as if she were merely a statue resting beneath glass, perfectly preserved in her own display case. I stared at Polly's naked body, ready to jot down my notes. My eyes descended from her head to her neck, torso, abdomen, and finally down to the thin, dark strip of hair between her thighs. I stepped back as an unexpected sensation pulsated through my body. I felt embarrassed. Her nude body reminded me of my own, and I felt a sudden impulse to cover her. I laughed awkwardly to myself and scribbled the remainder of my notes. Satisfied with my morning's work, I trudged up the snowy hill towards the house to make breakfast. I spent the remainder of the day working on my thesis and watching local television. As the sun set, I drew a bath to unwind. I rested against the back of the clawfoot tub and closed my eyes, soaking the day off my skin. For a brief moment, my head submerged under the warm water, and an image of Polly's pale skin and milky eyes flashed in my mind. I shot up out of the tub, angry with myself for falling asleep. as I began to dry off, a loud thud outside broke the quiet stillness of the night. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but my sense of logic and reason wouldn't allow me. Instead, I concluded that it must have been local wildlife. I was miles away from any other person, and no one in their right mind would be rummaging around the property in the cold at night. My attempt to calm myself was failing. I quietly crept down the creaky stairs and made my way to the sliding glass door at the back of the home. I slid it open and examined the property with my flashlight. All remained still besides the light. Falling snow. I decided that I would investigate in the morning as I closed and locked the door. Looking at the clock, I reasoned that it wasn't too late to call Jess, selfishly knowing her voice would make me feel less alone. We spoke for an hour before I went to bed with all of the lights on. That night, I dreamt of red flowers blooming through the white snow. The following morning was dreary and still. I brewed coffee and listened to the news. A storm was coming and projected to hit on Christmas Day. After breakfast, I geared up and began my rounds. Almost immediately, I saw what had made the loud noise in the night. The barrel near the shed had fallen over, and Barry's stiff, decomposing arm reached out towards the fresh snow. I approached cautiously. All seemed plausible at first, figuring the barrel must have toppled over from wind or wildlife. Professor Mannis had warned me of local coyotes and their appetite for human remains and bones. I pulled the barrel upright and inspected Barry. As soon as I saw his hand, my heart began to pound in my chest. The nails of his index, middle, and ring finger had been pushed back, as if he had clawed at something. I grabbed the barrel's lid from the snow and ran my fingers along the grain. Towards the center, I noticed 3 symmetrical scratches. I felt like I was going to vomit. I sealed the lid and began to think. I told myself it was the result of the barrel toppling over. His hand fell towards the lid, and the momentum caused the lacerations when his nails made contact with the wood. It made sense. There was nothing to worry about. I continued with my rounds. The specimens appeared intact and unmoved, giving me a sense of peace and security, until I came to the edge of the pond. I could see Polly as I approached, and immediately felt as though something wasn't right. I crouched down and examined the body once again. There was no embarrassment this time. I sat along the bank for a few minutes before it hit me. Polly looked like she was closer than she was the day prior. I quickly grabbed my measuring tape and extended it towards the icy corpse. Her head was 2 inches closer to the bank than it was the day before. The nausea and panic returned in full force, and my mind began to race for an explanation. "It's fine," I repeated to myself. "Temperatures change, and the water beneath the ice is still fluid. The corpse simply shifted in the night." I started to feel better and laughed at myself for being frightened. The solitude was simply getting to me. I finished my notes for the day and retired to the house. It was Christmas Eve. I deserved a little bit of fun. After lunch, I put on a Christmas record and made eggnog. The house felt warm and alive. I found it a welcome change from the usual eerie stillness. A few drinks later, I was finally feeling relaxed. I began rummaging through the Mannis home in search of Christmas decor. I found myself at the basement door, before remembering the professor's strict instruction to keep it closed and stay out. Half an hour later, I was satisfied with the 2 wreaths and strand of tinsel I discovered in a storage closet near the guest room. I melted into the couch with a freshly refilled glass, and my eyes grew heavy as Sinatra's rendition of Silent Night served as a lullaby. Just before I drifted off, 3 loud knocks at the door jolted me awake. I wasn't able to explain this. I felt adrenaline pulse through my body. Maybe I drifted instantly into a dream the second I closed my eyes. This idea was shattered as 3 more knocks rapped the glass of the sliding door. I dug down to the floor and contemplated my next move. The door was locked, I was sure of it. I knew then the best idea was to make a dash for the phone and call the police. Just before I took off, a muffled voice from the other side of the glass spoke. "Open the door, asshole!" I could have died if I hadn't started laughing so hard. Jess had come to surprise me. I unlocked the door and slid it open, nearly killing her with my hug. My eyes welled with tears at the realization that she had travelled to the Mannis farm in the snow just to spend Christmas with me. After catching up and a few more drinks, Jess proclaimed that this wonderful evening would most certainly not be right without a Christmas tree. Warmed from alcohol and our snow gear, we decided to head into the woods to chop down a small pine before the sun set. As we neared the shed, I thought of an idea that, at the time, believed would be hilariously brilliant. I told Jess to go into the shed and grab the axe. Under the tarp, I told her, since I had to check on one of the bodies in the back. I remember her distinctly saying, "As long as I don't have to see one of those things, I'm happy." I sat back and grinned ear to ear, waiting for Jess's screams as she would soon discover Sheila under the tarp. The screams never came. Instead, Jess emerged from the shed with the axe and said, "I didn't see a tarp, but the axe was leaning against the wall by the door. You know, for such a smart guy, you've got a terrible memory." I put on my best fake smile and bantered with her. My mind silently raced. She must have missed it, that's all. It's a dark shed. I'll check in the morning before the storm hits, and all of the bodies will be fine. We proceeded into the woods until we found the perfect little tree to chop down and bring back home. The night consisted of even more drinks, a little cannabis, and old memories. It was more than enough to help ease my anxiety. Jess and I eventually retired to the master bedroom and fell asleep as soon as our heads hit our respective pillows. The next morning blessed me with a Christmas hangover from hell. After a gallon of coffee, fried eggs and bacon, I suited up for my routine 25-minute workday. Groggier than usual, I shuffled through the fresh powder towards the shed. The snow was starting to pick up and I knew I didn't have much time. When the shed came into view, I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. The barrel had toppled over once again, but this time the corpse within was nowhere to be seen. I ran inside the shed, and just as I feared, there was no tarp and no Sheila. I sprinted to the field and dry creek bed, both of which were absent of their deceased inhabitants. Racing down the hill to the pond, I stopped and vomited when I reached the bank. Polly was gone as well. All that remained was a perfect, body-shaped cavity in the ice. My adrenaline was in full swing as I beelined to the back door of the Mannis home. Jess was smoking on the couch and nursing her booze flu. My frazzled appearance got her attention as she asked me if I was okay. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the phone and frantically dialed the number that Dr. Mannis had given me, which instantly went to an answering machine. Through my broken words, I was eventually able to articulate that all of the bodies had gone missing. Jess began to pelt me with questions, none of which I was able to answer. As the winter storm raged outside, Jess and I came to the grim conclusion that our only option was to lock ourselves in and wait it out. Few words were spoken as several hours flew by. The storm continued to increase in intensity as the grey, winter sun set beyond the tree line. Jess and I continued to comfort one another as night fell, telling ourselves that we would wait out the storm and leave first thing in the morning. We triple-checked the doors, windows, and kept the fire burning in the hearth. We felt secure and warm. This was short-lived, as a loud crash hit the roof and the lights went out. I heard Jess wince in the darkness as I held her close. I whispered that it was okay and the storm must have broken a tree branch outside. We made our way to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlights from under the sink. Jess suggested that we should check the fuse box, and I reminded her that the basement was off limits. Annoyed, Jess hissed that she preferred not to freeze to death on Christmas Day in a creepy body farm mansion. It was a compelling argument. A wave of musty air hit me as we opened the basement door and descended the stone stairs. I pleaded with Jess to be quick as we scanned the walls with our flashlights. Something about the basement didn't feel right, and I wished at that moment that I could be anywhere else. Jess walked over to the breaker and flipped them to no avail. As she worked, my eye was drawn to the stack of photos on a wooden table in the corner. I began to tremble as I flipped through them. All of the photos were of me. Candid and dating back to my first year at the university. My voice cracked as I called Jess over to look. She looked me in the eye and said, "We have to leave, now." I silently agreed. We scaled the stairs as fast as we could and shut it, only to be greeted by a snow-covered Dr. Mannis sitting on a chair in the foyer. A shotgun rested lazily next to him. I nervously spewed words and sentence fragments, telling him that we only went to the basement to look for the breaker, followed by a procession of confused questions as to why he wasn't in Florida. "I got your message. You worried me," was his only response. Grabbing the shotgun, he motioned Jess and I towards the front door. We obeyed without hesitation. "Why are you here?" Jess asked as we marched in the blistering snow. "I heard my specimens are missing," Mannis hissed. The beam of our flashlight struggled to cut through the darkness, but I knew we were nearing the shed through muscle memory. The crunching snow quieted as the wide-eyed Jess stopped dead in her tracks. "What's the problem?" an annoyed Professor Mannis asked. Jess did not respond and continued to stare, all colour draining from her face. I pointed my flashlight ahead and saw them. The silhouettes of 5 familiar humanoid beings standing completely still in the snow. Mannis whispered, "It worked," as he ripped the flashlight from my hand and slowly continued towards the row of figures. Jess quietly grabbed my arm and pointed to the pickup truck keys clipped to his belt. Jess and I shook our heads in silent agreement. "Absolutely incredible," Mannis proclaimed as he approached them. He couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. I squeezed Jess's hand tightly. It was now or never. I lunged forward and grabbed the keys as Jess pushed Mannis down onto his face. The shotgun fired as it made contact with the ground, blowing a hole through the chest of the corpse directly in front of him. The flashlight beam shot through the torso like sunlight escaping the clouds. "Run!" Jess yelled, snapping me out of shock. I turned and followed her towards the house. Mannis screamed incoherently as he struggled to find his footing. Another shotgun blast sounded as speeding BPs whistled past my ear. I screamed. I looked back momentarily as Mannis shrieked at the top of his lungs. In a split second, I saw the corpses descend on him like pigs at a trough. Mannis tried to shout once more, but merely choked as his mouth filled with blood. Jess fumbled with the keys as we climbed into the 4x4. We were both bawling our eyes out as we fishtailed down the gravel drive towards the main road. The next few months were filled with police interrogations, interviews, and an official resignation from the university. The official record states that the Mannis estate and farm were abandoned. The specimens on record, as well as Mannis himself, were never discovered. The Christmas season is approaching again. The Christmas season has become a trigger. It is always a difficult time of year for Jess and I. I've never had the confidence to share my story with others, but now I think it is crucial should I disappear. You see, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox yesterday. There was no postage, return address, or signature. The note simply read, "It's time to finish our study." I woke up to the faintest of noise again, a curse of mine that my sleep is always light. However, when awake, I heard it again. I went over to the window to see what was going on, and was startled by the blank face inches from mine. On the other side of the glass was an antique wooden mannequin, pristine in appearance. Once my heart rate settled and my panic resolved, only frustration took over. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and it definitely wasn't going to be the last. For the past few weeks, someone had been leaving a mannequin outside my window. I either found it like this, or in the morning when I drew the curtain. No matter what I did with the mannequin the day after, another one would inevitably show up. This added to my confusion, as decent mannequins aren't cheap. So, if this was a joke, it was adding up to be a pretty expensive one. The police were perturbed by this when I reported this to them, but until something illegal actually happened, they could only send extra patrols at night to scan the area, which always turned up nothing. The stress of these events didn't help my familial situation. For a number of months, my mother had been in a coma at the hospital, the looming question being if she'd make it. The doctors, in their annoying doctor speak, gave the most vague response that she had a 50-50 chance of making it out of the coma with no complications. Good odds in their opinion, but the idea that her life fell on the tip of a coin flip was frustrating on so many levels. My mother is an interesting woman. She was a very eccentric lady, which often perturbed the more conservative neighbours we had. Where most of the moms in my neighbourhood would talk about fine dining and books, she loved wearing black 24/7, being loud, and talking of her younger days where she'd run around in the forest and pretend to be a witch. She always talked of her old friend group, which she called the Crimson Sisters, since they all had almost identical flare red hair. My friends found it hilarious and were enraptured by all her tall tales, stories of the occult, spells, and the many shenanigans she did with her like-minded girlfriends. But not me. It was embarrassing, and something I always tried to keep people away from. The biggest benefit of being a son, however, was the looming inheritance. If she popped her clogs, I'd have a huge settlement, and a lot of land. She owned both our house and a cabin in the Lake District, a prime little rustic cottage that was bought by her parents when houses were the price of a small car, and it only appreciated in value. These were the building blocks to living the life I wanted, and they were so close. Everything hinged on the fate of my mother. I never hated her. In fact, quite the opposite. But I felt my time with her was up, and her time here wasn't necessary. When the doctors would leave me to tend to her, I didn't do anything malicious per se, but I wouldn't help. I'd squeeze the IV bags, hoping it'd aid the coin flip in my favour, stare at her and think of ways she could accidentally have a pillow over her face. I eyeballed the life support machine's plugs, but knew they always had backups far beyond my knowledge. Didn't want to make it too obvious. I even whispered words of discouragement to her, muttered that it was her time to go, that she'd be better off dead. Things that I felt might trigger her to head towards the light. She'd be peaceful there, I figured. Better than the hellscape our current world was in. It was a mercy. The stress of things were getting to me. My mood was ever darkening, and the looming thoughts were spiralling in my head, draining downwards into some terrible places. So I figured, why not get an early peek at the cabin and have a little getaway at the Lake District? I knew where the keys were because I had been there many times with my mother in the past. This was my chance to enjoy it with the peace and quiet of her absence. I packed light, grabbed the keys from her house, and made the somber drive through the scenic trails. It took a few hours, but it was worth getting tired from the drive to have that lovely crashing energy that lets you have the most perfect of sleeps. The peace was euphoric. No more sounds of the ever-busy city, no buzzing of the many electrical appliances that consume one's apartment. A looming silence blessed the property. I was in heaven on earth. I took my time wandering the cabin slowly, admiring every detail without the nagging presence of my mother. I went to my old bedroom and saw the left-behind vacation items, sports equipment, toys, little trinkets gifted to me over the years. My mother's room was a stark contrast. I'd never been in there before, not for long anyway. The room was much darker than the rest of the cabin, even with the lights on. Black curtains were adorned around the room in a scattered pattern, which gave off an almost fantasy vibe. Half-melted white candles were set about, dotted around the room. A large metal chest sat at the end of the bed, in the position of a neat sitting area. My mother never let me in her room by choice. When I asked her about it, she would just sigh and simply tell me I wouldn't understand her choice in decoration. That much was apparent. Though now, the trunk was calling to me in voices of curiosity. What was inside, I wondered. I flicked through the key set that I used for the cabin, but none of the keys worked. But I figured as much. My mother was not just a self-proclaimed witch, which I only took at face value, but knowing her all these years, she could easily be described as a trickster. I tried the wardrobe. It was adorned with many long flowing robes, corny outfits from an era gone, but no hidden compartment or key. I looked at the shelf and saw some books. They were of witchcraft and other dark history, but one stood out. A little book clad in what looked like a homemade leather bound. When I unwrapped it, I found the pages to be hollowed out, and in the middle was a little key. I found it. I popped open the mysterious trunk and was met with a pile of confusion. Body parts, all made from wood. Arms, legs, and other various parts, but one stood out like the cherry atop a cake. A head, blank, like a mannequin's. I slammed it shut, my mind racing with ideas that led to nowhere. Storms of confusion rummaged my mind. I decided I needed air and took to sitting outside to cool myself off. I sat outside on the decking, admiring the dark silhouettes of nature. But in the silence and solitude, it hit me that I was now alone out there. Something which was a luxury I wanted to relish in, but with the recent findings, now sat as a pit of anxiety. What I thought would be a peaceful setting started twisting in an unnerving tension. The silence started bearing down on me. The solitude made me feel insignificant and vulnerable. My eyes darted around the darkness, worrying about the shapes appearing out of nowhere. Any sounds that did pervade the silence were no longer serene, beautiful sounds of nature, but sensory threats. I ran inside and tried to settle down. I was psyching myself out, but I wanted to push through. When the cabin became mine, I had to get used to being there alone. I had to see the beauty in it. After all, this was what I wanted. Still, it was getting late, and I felt it was time to settle in, so I'd have ample time to hike the trails and get intoxicated on the fresh air of nature. Learn to enjoy myself at the cabin so I could make the most of it. I waddled over to the front door and clicked it locked. Then another click. Then another. More sounds were accompanying my own, which made me furrow my brow. I leaned around to peek outside and fell ass first on the ground. my breath welling up in my throat, not deciding if it wanted in or out like a misbehaved cat. I eventually choked out my breathing in fast bursts as I stared at the face before me, or lack thereof. A mannequin, much like the ones that haunted me at home. Thankful that I just latched the lock, I backed away in the hopes that that was it. Another mannequin that'd just stand out there and do nothing all night. But it still pervaded my thoughts on how it got all the way out there. I was miles from home. I knew for sure I wasn't followed. There was no way. The roads to the cabin were small country roads. I'd have seen headlights from a mile off. Yet, the majority of my trip was alone. The biggest question, though, one that could be summed up in one word, was why? Why was someone doing this? Why did they choose me? Why did they follow me so far out? Nothing made sense. I heard more taps, something I'd have drummed up to nature before, but now made me investigate, almost on autopilot. Another window, another face. More sounds, another window, another face. The house was getting surrounded by these still figures, one window at a time, each one in their own oppressive pose. I rushed upstairs, hoping the high ground would save me. I entered my bedroom and latched the door. My eyes scanned the furniture, trying to figure out the optimal way to barricade the door. However, the moment my eyes scanned over the window, a scraping started. I knew I'd regret pulling back the curtain, but I also knew I'd regret not doing so. I was left with no choice but to look. There it was, a mannequin, arms and legs splayed out like it was gripping onto the sill like a spider, its head cocked to one side in an almost curious manner. I was left to curl up on the ground and scream. I didn't know what to do. There was no rhyme or reason to any of this. They never moved, yet they were everywhere. They never attacked, yet I felt threatened. They were not human, yet I felt inferior. I had a make it or break it moment. I could be cursed by these unnatural abominations, plagued to the end of times, or I could do something about this. My fight response kicked in and I set to action. I grabbed a bat we had from my childhood. I stormed downstairs and burst out the front door. I was raring to go. The moment I took a few steps forward, a slamming sound jolted me upright from my braced position, followed by a draft. I turned to see the door firmly shut, with a mannequin standing in front of it, facing my way. All of the ones around the house also had their heads turned in my direction. My resolve weakened, but I was still itching for a fight. Until I turned around, and there were several new figures dotting the fields. More and more were appearing by the second everywhere I faced. I ran to my car and tried the handle. It was locked. The keys were inside. I squinted my eyes, trying to look for anything that could help, but my eyes only fell on one out-of-place detail. Among the figures were one or two that were different. Figures draped in dark, flowing robes and crimson red hair. I turned to the house and there were dozens in my way. I couldn't go back. I faced the road, hoping to run my way to the nearest house, but more silhouettes were dotting the road. I turned back and there were more, and they were closer. I turned back and they were now upon the car. I couldn't do anything. Everywhere I turned, they'd be there, and eventually, they were upon me. I curled up and screamed one last time before everything went black. The last thing I heard was my name whispered in my mother's voice. This echoed and became clearer until I woke up. The room was white. I stared at an unfamiliar ceiling. Many people were around me, with warm looks on their face. A welcoming sight. I was in the hospital. Among the many doctors around me was one figure that stood out, with flare red hair. My mother. She was calling me, urging me to wake, and when I finally focused on her, she teared up. The doctors told me they were relieved I'd woken. Apparently, it had been a few weeks since my trip to the Lake District. They found me beaten and broken, something I confirmed when trying to move. They informed me I was in a coma from the severe head trauma, but due to the damage to my head, they needed to put me in a medically induced coma in order to aid neurological recovery. They told me to rest up and spend time with my mother, that they'd be back later for treatment. Once they left, silence prevailed. My mother was turned away from me, seemingly in thought. I was in too much pain to move, not that I had a choice with the amount of restraint and casts on me. When she eventually turned to face me, a new face appeared. No longer was she the happy woman elated to see her son return from the brink, but a face of malicious energy radiated from behind a sly smirk. She slowly walked over and leaned in. I first thought for a kiss, but her lips stopped right next to my ear. Within, she whispered only one thing. "It's your turn now." For 32 years, I worked in the field of law enforcement, a dream of mine since I was a little boy. Of those 3 decades, I worked 15 as a homicide detective. I've seen things you couldn't fathom. The world is truly a messed up place. I have 2 reasons that I didn't completely lose my mind: my wife, Raven, and her son, Hunter. As of a year ago, I thought that I'd escaped the darkness, but now I fear that the darkness is invading my own home. My wife and I live in a 2-story house that we built several decades ago. We are a ways away from the bustle of our city, and our closest neighbours, who happen to be Hunter and his family, live about a mile down the road. We enjoy living in the relative solitude. I take our German Shepherd, Mr. Morris, on regular walks through the woods and on fishing trips with my Raven and I. Though I will never forget the horrors of humanity, I still felt as though I would finally be at peace with myself and the world. Is that so much for an old man to ask for? I started my day off the same as any other. I had a cup of joe, put on my worn sneakers, and took Mr. Morris on a walk at about 6 in the morning. My wife, a school teacher, had already departed for the day. The sun was peeking out over the horizon, bathing the light layer of snow in orange light. Mr. Morris ran out ahead of me, coming to a stop at the pond that we usually fished at. He promptly began barking, staring out across the waters. "Mr. Morris, quit your belly aching before you wake up your brother." I came to a stop beside him and looked across the black surface. Either my eyes were playing tricks on me, or someone was on the other side of the pond. It was still dark enough that I questioned myself and rubbed my eyes before glancing again at the other bank. Nothing. Mr. Morris continued barking for a few more seconds, but eventually a squirrel caught his attention. I wasn't so easily distracted. I continued to scan the trees across the way, but finally dismissed the subtle movement as that of an animal of some sort. Mr. Morris and I continued our walk without incident. I flipped on the news and sat down with a bacon, egg, and cheese croissant. Mr. Morris, likewise, lapped up the fresh food that I'd placed in his bowl. I took a bite of my croissant and focused on the television set. The newscaster was discussing the disappearance of a local woman, Denise Lawson. I had seen this before. The poor girl had been missing for about 2 weeks now. She was young, about 23 years old, with long, red hair and green eyes. For the 3rd time that week, I found myself remembering one of the darkest parts of my career. The disappearances had begun about a decade ago. 6 girls, aged 21 to 24, had mysteriously disappeared over the span of about 2 years. I will never forget their names. Patricia Bledsoe, Karen Whitaker, Julia Voss, Jamie Calloway, Nia Justice, and Felicia Smith. They all had 2 things in common: red hair and green eyes. Only the partial remains of 2 of them had ever been found. There had been no forensic evidence and no groundbreaking leads. Someone claimed to have seen a man with one of the girls on the night she disappeared, but that was about as close as we got to ever identifying the sick person who was taking these girls. This case was more than a little personal for me. Patricia Bledsoe was my wife's niece. I'd known her since she was a little girl. I stared down listlessly at my croissant, having suddenly lost my appetite. I put the plate on the end table and got up, headed to my computer, and tried to keep my mind occupied with some online solitaire. A few hours later, I got the call. It was, to my surprise, one of the officers from the station that I had known for a few years. I hadn't heard much from him since I had retired. "Barry?" "Hey, Detective Vincent, this is Barry." He sounded nervous. "I know, son, and you don't have to call me detective anymore. Just Dario. How are you doing, buddy?" Barry hesitated. I'm good. Dario, sir. It's about your wife." I could feel my insides twisting up, like they had when I first heard about Patricia's disappearance. "Where's my wife, Barry?" "Sir, we've brought her in for questioning. She's a suspect for the disappearance of Denise Lawson and Tatiana Graves." I got to the station as fast as I could. When I arrived, I confronted the captain, a man I'd known and collaborated for many years, Eric Lloyd. "Eric, what the hell are you getting at? Bringing my wife here to be handled for something we both full well know she didn't do." 3 other officers stepped forward, but Eric subtly waved them off. He was a tall and tired man with a clean-shaven face. He looked me in the eyes before responding. "Look, Dario, you know I have the utmost respect for both you and Raven. You were at my wedding, for Christ's sake, but I have to do my job regardless. Surely you understand that." I was fuming. What could possibly make you think that Raven was involved in any of these incidents? If I had a criminal living under my roof, don't you think I would know? There was a glint in Eric's eyes, and I already knew what he was going to say. "I don't know, Detective. Your son was committing arson while he was still in your house, if I remember correctly." "How dare you bring that up?" Eric sighed. "Look, just wait a few and your wife will be right out, okay? But heed my warning. Don't interfere with our investigation. With all due respect, you're not with the force anymore, sir." I paced back and forth for almost 10 more minutes, cursing indiscriminately. When Raven finally walked up to me, I didn't even notice her. "Honey?" "Raven, are you okay?" I took her in my arms and then stood back, examining her closely. She looked great for a woman of 54, her blonde hair falling past the shoulders, her heart-shaped face as full of life as it had been when I first met her all those years ago. "Yeah, old man, I'm fine. Let's go home. I want to see Gabriel." I could feel the eyes of the other officers on me as I guided my wife out of the station. We decided that she could pick her car up from school when I dropped her off the next day. Then, of course, the conversation immediately turned to why she had been brought to the station in the first place. Eric picked me up because, well, it hurts to say this, but apparently I was one of the last people seen with Tatiana Graves before she went missing. "Who is she? You've never told me about any friends with that name." Raven sighed and looked out of the passenger window. "Tatiana was a former student of mine. She graduated a few years ago, but when I had drinks with Miriam a few nights ago, we happened to run into her. We had a good old time. Nothing seemed to be bothering her." "Eric's always been trigger happy," I muttered through gritted teeth. When I see him in town again, I'll be sure to give him a piece of my— No, Dario, it's fine. Erica's just doing his job. He and the other officers were very polite during the interview. They don't mean us any harm. I was still aggravated about the whole situation, but I was happy to see that my wife was okay. I pulled up to our son's house, and we were greeted at the door by his wife, Ellie, and their 3-year-old, Gabriel. Hunter was still at work, but Ellie kept us entertained. After about an hour or so, though, I wanted to go and check on Mr. Morris. Ellie volunteered to drop Raven off after Hunter got back from work, so I went back to the house alone. Mr. Morris was waiting for me in the yard. I scratched him behind his ears, and we both went inside. Curious, and with no time to kill, I set my eyes on the computer again. Sure, I was retired, but I still felt a sort of personal obligation to figure this out. I had sworn to myself long ago that I would be the one to catch this sicko. I searched Tatiana Graves' name. When her image popped up, I groaned, shaking my head. She bore a damn good resemblance to Patricia, as did all of the others who had vanished before her. It hurt to look at her for too long. I scrolled down to read more info about her disappearance. She was 21, having graduated from the school that my wife taught at 3 years ago. Besides that, nothing else was really known about her. There was nothing said about her hobbies or occupation. I scrolled down to the comment section, wondering if anyone might post anything more in depth. The first comment I saw read, "Whore, she got what she deserved." Shaking my head, I proceeded with the next two, which consisted of wishes and prayers for her family. The comment after that was by another woman who mentioned her getting around. Either these women were horrible, horrible trolls, or Tatiana had built a sort of reputation for herself. I was done with this regardless. It was time for a walk. The air was as frigid as I wanted to be towards Eric the next time I saw his sorry ass. I trudged along behind Mr. Morris, who stopped to pee on every tree before we came to the pond again. I remember the strange movement that I had seen earlier that day and decided to investigate. I made my way to the other side of the pond, which was, quite honestly, a rarity. I intended to look for footprints, but the light snow had already melted. Still, I investigated the area and came to a quick conclusion. Someone had most definitely been here. A piece of black plastic, as though from a trash bag, had caught onto a hanging branch. It hadn't faded in the sun, nor was it dirty from prolonged exposure. I reached up and fingered it curiously, then looked around. Mr. Morris was lying on the ground, chewing on something. "Hey, spit it out, you scoundrel." Mr. Morris looked up at me guiltily. I could see something gold glinting in his mouth. I knelt down and pulled it out, staring at it in disbelief. It was a bracelet. What the? I'd never seen it before. Raven definitely didn't own one like it. I investigated the area further, but found nothing else out of the ordinary. I decided to head further out into the property. If someone was trespassing here, they had chosen the wrong day to do it. I had my pistol in a holster on my waist, as per usual. I kept one hand on it as Mr. Morris and I pressed on. I hadn't been on this side of the pond in a while. The area was heavily wooded, and I honestly had no reason to ever come this far. My son, Hunter, however, was another story. When he was going through his pyromania phase, he'd been out here burning whatever he could get his hands on a regular basis. In the days before that, we'd built him a treehouse on a tree that he had picked out when he was 6 years old. That same old treehouse was still somehow in one piece, though the rickety ladder that he had once used was another story entirely. I paused, my breath rising in front of me as I surveyed the scene before me. There was an indent in the grass and soil down below, indicating that the old ladder had been laying on the ground for quite some time recently. Now, however, it was leaned up against the tree, leading up to the treehouse. I could feel a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I looked down at the bracelet, then up at the treehouse. Someone had recently climbed up there, and I suspected they were still there. Mr. Morris sat and watched me as I slowly approached the ladder. I put one hand on it, staring up at the old wooden treehouse. "My name is Dario Vincent, and if anyone is up there, you have trespassed on my property. Come out now and I won't get the proper authorities involved." Silence. The wind blew, fluttering my jacket and hood. I kept my eyes on the little windows of the treehouse, searching for any movement. Nothing. "Okay, if you're not going to come out, I'll have to come up and get you myself." I put one foot on the ladder, which gave a sudden shake. I should have known I was going to regret the cheeseburger from the other day. I began slowly ascending the ladder, which quivered perilously with every rung I reached. I held the bracelet tight in my hand as I climbed, determined to get to the bottom of this. There was a good chance that whoever was in the treehouse was part of this whole thing. A foul, terrible, familiar stench suddenly wafted into my nostrils. I paused, now nearly at the top of the ladder. No way, there couldn't be a... I put a hand on the top rung. The sound of a gunshot exploded nearby, more terrible than thunder in the heaviest storm. Startled, I lost any balance that I had on the ancient ladder and felt myself toppling over. The world was suddenly upside down, and then it was gone entirely. I was in pain, a lot of pain. My head felt like it had split open, and I knew that my radius was fractured. I groaned as I laid there in the cold grass, forgetting momentarily why I was lying there. Then I opened my eyes. Hunter was leaning over me, an old dirty red cap on his head, his brown eyes wide. "Hey Pa, you okay?" I don't think so. Help me stand up, son." I offered him my non-fractured arm and he pulled me to my feet. "What the hell just happened?" "You were up on the ladder, so I guess you didn't see it. There was a cougar sneaking up on Mr. Morris. I tried to kill it, but missed my shot." I glanced down at Mr. Morris, whose chocolate eyes were fixed on me. "How'd you find us?" "I heard you yelling. I was wondering who you were talking to." "The treehouse, Hunter. We have to get to the tree." "Pa, you have blood running down your face. Let's get you to the doctor. What are you so interested in up there anyway?" I glanced back up at the wooden house that I'd built so many years ago. "I'll tell you later." It was during the drive to the doctor's office that I realized my cell phone was missing. Had it fallen out of my pocket by the treehouse? "Hey buddy, do you remember seeing my phone in the grass back there?" Hunter kept his eyes on the road as he drove. "Nah, Pa, I don't think so. Why, is it missing?" "Yeah, you have yours?" He shook his head. "Left it back at my house. We can call Ma and Ellie from the doctor's office." It wasn't Raven who I was intending to call. We returned a couple of hours later. I was stitched up and wore a sling in my left arm. Hunter dropped me off at home, where I knew I was going to be in trouble. "What the hell is the matter with you? You could have at least told me you were leaving. Ellie and I were worried sick." "Yeah, darling, I'm sorry. I was losing a lot of blood apparently, and Hunt didn't want to take any chances." "What were you doing out there anyway? How'd you hurt yourself?" It's horrible to admit this, but I couldn't trust anyone. The corpse was on my property. That meant any of my family members could have been involved. So I lied. There was some still snow melting out there. I slipped and fell down one of them damn slopes. I'm just glad Hunt was out there to help me out. I just think that I left my phone out there. I'm gonna go back and grab it. Raven surveyed me from her spot in the kitchen, a book lying open in front of her. "Okay, be careful, old man." I couldn't climb the ladder with a fractured bone, So I fully intended to call Eric to send a couple officers out to discover the corpse for me. I hadn't gotten far before the smell of smoke reached my nostrils. Oh no. I ran the rest of the way to the treehouse, and my suspicions were confirmed. It had been set ablaze. Black smoke rose from the burning tree, and heat emanated from it, making me forget about the cold. I collapsed to my knees, staring in despair. The killer knew how close I'd been to finding the body. I was now in danger myself. I noticed my phone, which was lying near the spot where I'd landed. I crawled over to it to make the call. Eric, I need you to get over to my house as soon as you can. After the firefighters doused the flames, the investigation work started. The charred remains of a human had indeed been found. Eric told me he would do some more investigating on our property, but also that I needed to be careful. I remember his eyes flickering over Raven during most of our conversation. Raven was completely distressed. She insisted that we sleep over at Hunter's, wanting the family to all be together. I sent her on her way, promising to meet her there. I told her that I wanted to speak with Eric more. In reality, however, I wanted to do some investigating of my own. I went through Raven's drawer, closet, and every other area of the house that I could. It wasn't until I dropped an old photo album of hers that I noticed something odd. The album had flipped open, and I could see a photo that we had taken together as a family. Hunter, still a teenager, was already taller than the rest of us. Raven stood next to her sister, Amber, the two of them grinning. Amber's daughter, my precious Patricia, was standing between Amber and I, and her arm around my shoulder. But I could no longer see her face. Someone had used a cutting device of some sort to crudely scratch it up, rendering her unidentifiable. I flipped to the next page and found that the same had been done on another picture of Patricia. Every single photo of her had been vandalized. What the hell? I closed the album and put it back where I'd found it. This was going to raise my blood pressure. I didn't want to believe that my family was really a part of this, but at this point, it was obvious that something was off. I went to check Hunter's old room, and upon inspecting his closet, I cried out and fell on my ass, pushing myself backwards. Mr. Morris dashed into the room to check on me, but my eyes were on the old mason jar that I'd just discovered. It was full of human teeth. I heard the creak of the back door in the other room. Oh no. I leapt up and slammed the closet door. I tried to hurry out of the room. In my haste, I tripped and fell, and the pain in my arm flared up. I could hear the slow footsteps of someone approaching down the hall. I reached down and pulled my gun from the holster. Pa? What are you doing? Hunter had appeared in the doorway. He stared in confusion from me to the gun in my hand, to Mr. Morris, and finally to the closet. Oh, hey bud. Mr. Morris nudged his way in here, and I came to grab him. It's kind of dusty, so I lost my footing and my gun fell out. I was just picking it up. Okay. Come on, we're all waiting for you. It's safe to say I didn't get much sleep that night. What little sleep did come to me only resulted in nightmares. I would hear the creaking of the door, the agonized wailing of a woman being tormented, and a sweet voice as she moaned my name. Dario! Dario! Raven was already off to work when I woke the next morning. I took Mr. Morris on a walk and returned to my house. I should have called Eric about the teeth, I know, but I've already said it before. This case is personal, and I had a promise to keep for myself. I knew that the investigation of the property would soon extend to my own home, so I had to work quickly. I made my way back to Hunter's old room and quickly inspected the closet. I felt my soul drop out of my body. The teeth were gone. I went back over to the place where the photo album had been stashed and discovered that it too was gone. One thing, however, had been left behind. Whoever had been in the house must have been in a hurry and forgot it lying on the bed. A little black book that looked to be a diary. I picked it up and thumbed through it. This had most definitely belonged to Hunter when he was growing up. He had drawn pictures, wrote stories, and just discussed little things like his old man teaching him how to shoot or swimming in the lake with his cousin Patricia. Then I got to the last page. Scribbled on it, in red marker, was one word. Sugar pie. I took advantage of the time alone and whipped out the old map that focused on the locations that each of the girls had last been seen in. Karen Whittaker had told her roommate that she was going to work, which happened to be a strip club down the street from where they lived. Karen had been known to walk to work, it was so close. Her abductor could have easily learned the typical path she took to get to work. Julia Voss had been on a date with her boyfriend the night she went missing. We'd interrogated him pretty harshly, but it was evident that the guy wasn't to blame. Julia too had been out alone late at night, possibly doing some last-minute shopping before being offered a ride from the abductor. Jamie Calloway had actually vanished in broad daylight, having last been seen at a community college. Nia Justice, whose mandible had been found in a field later on, had been taken after a friend's birthday party. Felicia Smith had gotten into an argument with a friend at a bonfire and stormed off drunk, never to be seen again. Sweet Patricia, my sugar pie, had last been seen by, well, according to the investigation, her mother, Amber, who she had visited on that fateful evening. That brought me to the two new girls. The abductor had taken Denise Lawson as, again, she walks home from work. And I don't know all the details about Tatiana Graves yet, but apparently she had had drinks with my wife on the night that she disappeared. I studied the map intently and, with my family in mind, made a discovery that had flown right over my head before. The strip club, restaurant, community college, apartment the party had taken place at, the site of the bonfire, and the bar had each been within 5 miles of the school that Raven taught at. 3 of the 8 girls had graduated from that same school. At least 2 of them had unsavory reputations. Karen, the stripper, and Tatiana, who had apparently been getting around. The only other thing all these girls had in common was their unremarkable resemblance to each other. Whoever the abductor had been, he was either incredibly persuasive or didn't work alone. It was, however, unlikely that these girls would take rides offered to them by strange men. A woman, however, would seem more friendly and trustworthy, especially if she happened to be a well-known local teacher. I took a swig of the bourbon that I had retrieved from my hidden stash. I had been sober for about 8 years now, or at least that's what my wife thought. I took 2 more big gulps before sitting back, staring at the map of the city before me. I found myself thinking about Hunter's diary, the word that he had scribbled. Hunter had been attending the high school that his mother taught at 10 years ago. He was a junior when Patricia had first gone missing, and there was no way he knew that name. No way anyone could have known that name. There was the incident in the woods with the gunshot that had nearly caused me to break my neck. Why hadn't he just straight up shot me, you say? Well, it's easier to explain away an accident than it is 2 members of your family going missing, especially with one of them being your father. Hunter would know that Eric and the full force would be all over him if he had been foolish enough to try get rid of me. He had seen me climbing the ladder to get to the treehouse, but when had the fire started? Had Raven set the treehouse ablaze just before I arrived back home? Had Hunter tipped her off? Or did she just suspect that I'd gotten hurt climbing the old ladder? The ladder which had been left lying on the ground after I'd fallen? I took another swig and grimaced. Speaking of the ladder, there was no way in hell anyone would have been able to haul a dead body up it. The victim, most likely Dennis Lawson, would have to be taken to the treehouse alive, perhaps ordered by gunpoint to climb the ladder and into it. For what reason? I found myself thinking of the teeth and felt sick. The abductor was likely torturing these girls brutally before slaying them. Eric had only recovered one corpse from the burnt treehouse, but the other girls had been dead for a decade now. Their murderer could have easily dispatched their bodies by now. And then there was the black trash bag. The back door creaked. "Pa? Hey, it's me and Elle. We came to keep you some company." I didn't respond. I'd come to my conclusion. The diary was the MO. It all made sense now. I'd been suspecting Raven, but no, this all came down to one person. My son. He was the one who had taken my sugar pie away from me. Hunter's head popped around the doorway. "I bought crab legs and..." He trailed off, his eyes going from the map to the bottle of whiskey. "Pa, I thought you quit drinking a long time ago." My eyes were watering. "Hunter, how about you and me go for a walk, I need to talk to you about something." I could hear Ellie making Gabriel laugh in the living room. Hunter looked worried, but he shrugged. "Okay, Pa." I looked him over and took note that he wasn't carrying his gun. Good. I took one more drink from the bottle before standing up and walking up to him. I clapped him lovingly on the back of his neck and rubbed his back. I led him to the back door, and Ellie looked up from playing with Gabriel. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, Ellie. We'll be back," I replied, and shut the door behind me. There was a light snow falling, and the air was crisp. The tension between my son and I was clear, and not even the presence of Mr. Morris trotting along ahead of us was enough to soothe either of us. We walked in silence for a bit, eventually coming to the police markers that prohibited us from moving any further. No one was out here, however, so we trotted on. After a few more painful minutes, Hunter finally gathered the courage to speak. "You okay, Pa?" "Oh yeah, I'm just fine, son. Good land we got, Your mother and I moved out here about 30 years ago. If anything, this place was a bargain. I love her just as much as I did back then. There's nothing I wouldn't do for her, or for you. You know that, right?" Hunter was staring down at the snow as we crunched through it. "Of course, Pa. What are you getting at? You want to tell me something?" "The son of a... He had the audacity..." "No, Hunt. I think it's you who has something to say. Speak up now, boy." I had my hand on my pistol now. Hunter saw this and came to a stop, his brown eyes wide and bewildered, his breath rising up from in front of him. "Pa, I don't know what you're talking about. What the hell is going on right now?" My cell phone began to ring. I answered it without taking my eyes off of Hunter. "This is Dario." "Hey, Dario." It was Eric. "I wanted to give you a heads up. A friend to a friend. Please don't make me regret it. I have 3 squad cars en route to your house. In addition to the remains in the treehouse, we retrieved a mutilated corpse in a trash bag from the pond. It was Tatiana, Dario. We're gonna have to bring you all in. Raven, Hunt, Ellie. I know you're the one who kickstarted the investigation, but you have to come too. You know the protocol." "Thanks, Eric, but come fast. I suspect my son may attempt to kill me in the next few minutes." "What?" I hung up. Hunter had turned as white as the snow around him. "Pa, why did you say that?" I shrugged. "It was strategic. This way, I can claim self-defense when the judge asks why I shot you." Mr. Morris sat watching us from a few feet away, his head tilted. "Pa, what the hell are you talking about? Why would you shoot me? This is crazy. Let's just go back to the house." "I won't have to shoot you as long as you admit to it. Even though I want to, I won't do it. Even after what you did to her." Hunter was shaking, though whether it was from the cold or absolute fear, I did not know. "To... who?" "I saw your diary, Hunt. Sugar pie." Hunter's shock shone through, clear as day on his face. He clenched his fists. "Pa, don't lie to me, Hunter. You know." Hunter glanced down at the ground, his own eyes tearing up now. Of course I do, Pa. I would wake up from the damn creak of the back door every time. He looked me in the eyes. You would wait until Mom was off visiting Grandma or with her friends or working that second job she had at the time of the weekend. I could have forgiven you if it had been a random whore off the street, or if it had been a different woman each time. It could have been any woman in the world, but you chose Patricia, your wife's niece. My grip tightened on my pistol, still in the holster. Watch your tone with me, boy. I've already told you I can shoot you at any moment. I didn't choose Patricia. We found each other. She had been down in the dumps. She had even considered taking her own life. Your mother herself was withdrawing from me. I don't know if it was the long hours on the job or her coping with her father's death, but I was lonely. Patricia reached out to me. I believed we saved each other. Hunter looked repulsed. I don't want to hear it. I heard enough of it back then. The bed slamming against the wall, you calling her that disgusting ass name. Did you really think I wouldn't hear you? It's a wonder Mom never walked in on you. Don't detract, Hunt. Whatever you thought of Patricia, you did not need to kill her, nor any of those other girls. Mr. Morris let out a long, low howl of discomfort. Hunter looked incredulous. Is that what this is about? Pa, I love you, but I never forgave you. I will never forgive you for what you did to Patricia and to Ma. But murder? Who do you think I am? I whipped my gun out of the holster. Don't lie to me. The teeth, the diary. What teeth? And despite what I saw, I never wrote about you and her. Hearing it was bad enough. Why would I put it into words? I heard Raven's far-off voice in the distance. Dario? Dario, what are you doing? Her yelling made me momentarily spin around. That gave Hunter enough time to charge me. He tackled me and we both went down to the ground. He was bigger and stronger than me, and I was fighting with one arm, but I was possessed with a fury greater than any in hell. My own son had been the one who had taken her life and the lives of the other girls, simply because they resembled her, and all while living under my roof. He was truly a psychopath. My burning desire for justice kept my grip tight on the Glock, but Hunter was persistent. Mr. Morris was going crazy, as was my wife, who was running over towards us. Then, the gun went off. Hunter was still atop of me. His eyes widened, as did mine. I could feel a heavy, warm wetness down around my midsection. Hunter stared at me in shock, then muttered, Pa? He toppled over off of me as his mother screamed. I pushed myself up, looking at the gunshot wound in my son's gut. Despite everything, the sight of my baby boy bleeding out rendered me speechless. I looked at my gun in absolute disgust and hurled it across the way. I then pushed my hand down on the wound, applying pressure. Hunter, son, I'm so sorry. Raven finally made it over to us and fell to her knees beside our boy as well. Hunter was bleeding from his mouth now. He looked up at us, gave a shudder, and then he was gone. Mr. Morris continued barking, and Raven and I remained there with our son until Barry and the other officers arrived. Next came a long interviewing process. I told Eric that Hunter had been watching me after I discovered the first corpse in the treehouse. I told him about the teeth, the diary, and the photo album. When asked why he may have wanted to kill his own cousin 10 years previously, I must admit, I'm a coward, and I didn't own up to my own sins. I didn't tell him I had an affair with Patricia. My wife had just lost a son. Why would I lay that heavy burden on her now? I instead told Eric that Hunter may have been jealous of the attention that I showered on his cousin, making him ride the bus to school while I hadn't hesitated in helping her buy a car and so forth. Eric expressed his sorrows for the devastating loss that my family had just suffered, our second in 10 years. When Raven, Ellie and I left the station, we were numb. Raven offered to spend the night at a hotel with Ellie, who wasn't ready to go back to the house. Gabriel had been left to spend the night with Ellie's mother. I didn't want to leave Mr. Morris alone, so I told them I'd be going back to the house. to sit and prepare for the ramifications of the day's events. Ellie went up to the hotel room, but Raven stayed with me at the truck. Dario, I don't know what to say. I don't blame you. If what you say is true, then Hunter... Oh, I wish he was still here. But you had to defend yourself. Don't talk about it. I know it'll be hard to try not to think about either. We'll be okay. It's going to be rough for the next few months, but we'll make it. Don't love our son any less than you did before. Nobody is perfect. Raven met my eyes and gave me a sad smile. I love you. I love you. We kissed and she stepped back, looking down at the ground. The snow drifted softly around her. All right, drive carefully. I'll see you tomorrow, sugar pie. She turned to walk away, and I stared dumbly at the back of her head. Wait, honey, what was that? Raven stopped and turned back. Huh? Oh, I said I'll see you tomorrow. We stared at each other for a few seconds, and then she turned and walked away. I sat there in the truck for a long time after that. The world is truly a messed up place. That's what my dad always used to say, with a chuckle and a pat to my head. She's a keeper, he'd say to a grocer or clerk at a convenience store. People used to fawn over the cute pigtail girl by her daddy's side. Always said her pleases and thank yous and never threw a tantrum. Was an absolute angel. Maybe this is why when I grew up, I always need someone giving me a pat on the back. If I'm not getting a compliment about how I look or how well I did at work, I'm gonna assume I did something wrong or had a piece of lettuce stuck in my teeth all day. This hasn't always worked out for me. I'm a keeper, but I can also be a sucker. Like what's been happening with my boss. I love working as a secretary. It's a job that makes me feel really fulfilled. This makes me a bit of a stereotype though, with how I practically melted when Jonathan Price, my boss, complimented my blouse and my work ethic on my first day. I just reminded myself by looking at the silver ring on his left hand and the picture on his desk with his children that I shouldn't read too much into it. Jonathan was perfect though, and over time I realized I read him just right. I never wanted to be the other woman. I just wanted to be loved, and being around Jonathan, working late nights just to have a moment to talk with him, having drinks after work, the inevitable happened. He kissed me after too many beers, and we ended up going back to my place. We slept together. I poured my heart out to him after that, how I'd liked him for so long, and that I really felt a connection with him. He just smiled and brushed the hair from my eyes, telling me that I was the kind of girl you didn't just let get away. Of course I believed him. Of course I swallowed the lump in my throat whenever I saw Mariana coming to visit her husband, my lover. Of course I ignored how I was the choice topic of office gossip, how the guys smirked and the other women gave me the side eye and the cold shoulder. Of course I listened when Jonathan said he was going to leave her soon. He just needed to make sure he didn't hurt her. And of course, whenever he called me to meet him at our typical meeting spot, a hotel in downtown, I was there with bells on. Yeah, I know what you're thinking of me. I think it too. I'm not the brightest bulb in the package, but like I told you, I'm pretty easily manipulated. But I love Jonathan. I love his work ethic. I love how he takes care of his kids that he learned soon enough I couldn't have. I wonder if that was part of my appeal to him, that he couldn't accidentally knock me up. He didn't love me. I was just easy, a stereotype in every sense of the word. I only started wising up last week when it occurred to me that Jonathan really wasn't slowing down on his relationship with his wife and certainly wasn't preparing for divorce proceedings. She was pregnant with their third child. I saw the pictures he posted on Facebook of their anniversary dinner. It hit me like a semi-truck when I read his status about enjoying their 15 years together and couldn't wait to see what their next 15 will bring. I cried. I drank a lot of wine, and then I asked him to come to my apartment, that we needed to talk. Scary words for a guy, right? Took Jonathan a while to drag his ass over, which by then I was even more drunk. I don't drink often, and certainly not in excess, but can you blame me? I just had that reality-shattering realization I was just his pet to call on whenever he wanted to bang and spew nonsense words at. Nonsense words I fell for. Well, I did what I should have done about 6 months ago. I called him out on his BS. Said that he was never going to leave his wife, but he wasn't going to stop keeping me as his side piece. He tried. Oh, he tried to calm me down, but I wasn't going to back down to his pretty words this time. Either pick me or stay with your wife, or else I'll call her and let her know the truth. My ultimatum I'd spent the previous hour preparing. I felt super proud of it when I spat it out, expecting him to pick at least one of the options so this nonsense could end. Jonathan's face went white, then red, and then he picked a third option. He killed me. Jonathan picked up the empty wine bottle while he muttered something about me being too much trouble, and then he brought it down right on the top of my head, caved my skull in on the first smash, sending shards of glass all over my living room. I dropped like a rock, but I guess Jonathan was just too furious because he used the remains of the bottle in his hand to keep stabbing me again and again in the throat and neck. I was about decapitated by the time he came to his senses. Of course, Jonathan freaked out, panicked, just washed the blood off his hands and wiped down the bottle before escaping the apartment. Left me there, all alone, head nearly off my shoulders, my living room a mess of blood, wine and glass. Man, you should have seen the look on his face when I came into work today. I was at my desk by the time he came in. He looked like hell, understandably. He just killed a woman 2 days before. But he froze in his steps when he saw me sitting at my desk, tip-tapping away on my keyboard while scheduling another appointment later that week. I just waved to him real quick before going back to work. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jonathan bolt for his office and slam the door. Oh, that felt good. Watching him be the one to run in fear. Was he doubting his memory? Was he trying to convince himself that he just had a really bad dream? I clocked out after that, complaining about a cold. It had been passed all around the office, but I didn't go home. I went to Jonathan's home, a nice house in the nice part of town. I saw his wife working in the small garden out front, and after adjusting my scarf, I got out and walked up the drive. She didn't see me until I was right behind her. Mariana was a pretty woman, even right now with a smudge of dirt across her face, no makeup, and her auburn hair held back in a yellow bandana. I cleared my throat, and she nearly dropped the flower bulb she had in her hands. She glanced up, immediately recognizing me. "Oh, hi Nicole, is something wrong?" She got up, brushing off her hands and smiling from ear to ear. Her pregnancy was just starting to show, her belly just so slightly growing. "Can we talk inside?" "Oh, sure, sweetheart. The kids are at school. Won't be back for a few more hours. Are you alright? Your voice sounds a bit raspy." "I'll be fine." I waited until she was sitting down before I began the most difficult conversation of my life, and I got the most difficult part of it out of the way first. "Your husband and I have been having an affair for almost a year." It was so sad to see how Mariana just sighed, how she just nodded. I figured, with all the late nights at work and business trips that didn't take him out of town, I was just about to hire a private investigator to start checking in on him, so you saved me a chunk of change. "Are you still sleeping with him?" I shook my head. "No, I figured that ended when he about took my head off with a wine bottle," I said. Her brow knitted in concern. So I decided to show her. I undid the scarf around my neck and showed her what I'd been hiding all morning at work. My neck is a sight right now, all purple and black and covered in decaying, cut up flesh. I can't even imagine how the smell must be to someone not used to it. The putrefaction had spread down my chest, which I showed her by unbuttoning my blouse. I'd have to start tearing my skin off to get any sort of relief. You can't imagine how horrid the itching gets when your flesh starts rotting off the bone with your skin holding it all in. I even removed the gloves to show off the pus-filled sores and bubbles forming on my wrist and fingers. Mariana went white as a sheet when she took it all in. It looked so wrong. My face perfect, as it always has been. But from the neck down, I look like rotting roadkill. When the wave of stench finally hit her, she bolted for the bathroom. I could hear her violently throwing up from where I sat. I just about buttoned my shirt back up when she came back, teetering a bit and still looking pale but managing to remain steady. "Wait, show me again." I shrugged and unbuttoned my shirt again. If she wanted another reason to barf again, she was welcome to it. But she didn't. She sat behind me, her expression of disgust melting away into one of wonder. "Before Jonathan insisted I take care of the kids full time, I used to be a surgeon. You shouldn't be alive. You can't be alive. Are you a ghost?" "No," I shook my head. "This just happens sometimes. I'm surprised it happened after your husband killed me. I thought I was a goner. But then I woke up with my body falling apart. Maybe I was due for a shedding. Maybe this just happens when I get hurt real bad. I don't know." "Jonathan," she shuddered and shook her head. "He can be an ass, but he beat me with a wine bottle, Mariana." I pulled the bloody shards out of my purse. And then when it broke, he stabbed me in the neck, all because I told him the affair was over. Now she was crying. Tears rolled down her cheeks as her bottom lip wobbled with her sobs. No. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I need your help." I rebuttoned up my blouse, but I left the scarf on my lap. "It'll take me a few weeks to really come back together, but my daddy told me of a way to help me heal faster. His sister was like me, fell apart, rotted like a corpse, and then looked just as pretty as ever in a few days. It took longer though, much longer, before she started working as a mortician. It didn't take any effort at all to convince her to help me. The kids are having a sleepover at Grandma's tonight. They really are cuties. There's a wine glass laced with sleeping medication ready for Jonathan when he gets home, and I'm waiting in the basement, passing the time by ripping off more rotten skin, wondering what human flesh will taste like. Mariana's already said I can stay here while I recover. She wants to study me. I'm something she's never seen before, and she's fascinated. She says I'm a real keeper.